Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we dig in deep to analyze the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. I'm Andy Nelson from The Next Reel. And of course, we are talking about Jon Favreau's 2008 film, Iron Man. Joining me again today is guest Matthew Westfox from the Superhero Ethics Podcast. Hey, Matthew.
Hey, I'm looking forward. I had a lot of fun recording the last one, and this one especially I'm looking forward to, because here we get to dive into some pretty good world building.
There's going to be a lot of fun stuff to talk about. We are, of course, looking at minute 45. On today's show, the minute starts with Agent Phil Coulson showing off his rather long acronym and ending with Tony reminiscing about his father. This is the minute where we really get to meet Agent Coulson. Clark Gregg, of course, playing Agent Coulson. This was a really interesting part because initially he was just cast as Agent, and they liked him so much and thought he was bringing so much to the role that they fleshed him out a little bit, gave him a full name, and it became so popular because it's not based on anything in the comics. He became so popular that he got his own series, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and actually started appearing in the comics. It's really interesting to see a film character like this become something that strikes a chord with people and makes it so far. It's really interesting.
That's fascinating, because I have a lot of my own reasons for loving this moment that I'll get to. But one thing you always think about is the connection between the comics and then the MCU kind of linear or cyclical. And I love it that from this very first movie, we're getting the cyclical. That obviously the comics are what creates the movie and the TV shows, but then what's happening on the screen is now feeding back into the comics world. And the idea that started all the way back here is, I think, really cool.
It is. It's really interesting to see how it kind of all led back around to this. And I always talk about when we meet new characters, where they started off. Mm-hmm. And as I said, he hadn't been in any comics. So Agent Coulson's first appearance in a comic book was actually a limited series called Battle Scars. It was a 6-issue limited series that ran from January through June 2012. And interestingly, the character and all of his designs over the number of different issues that he's been in have been designed based on Clark Gregg. So he's an interesting actor in that he, I guess you can say, actually has a comic book character designed to look like him, which is kind of fun.
Well, and I have to say, when I first saw him on screen, I immediately knew what kind of role he was. It's not that I knew that he was going to be from S.H.I.E.L.D., and that was a great moment, but I had known of Clark Gregg because he had a small, but I thought very important role on The West Wing, which was a show that I'm a huge fan of. I don't know if you know it well.
I have never seen an episode, but I know of it. It's one of those ones that for some reason I've always missed.
On that show, he plays Special Agent Casper, who is an FBI agent who first comes into contact with the West Wing crew because there's something is happening that the FBI has to brief the White House about, and he is sort of the special liaison. And he plays a very similar kind of character, unassuming, but very competent, knows what's going on, very quippy, and has a lot of kind of back and forth dialogue. And he had just been one of those, like, he pops up maybe once or twice a season for a couple seasons. And it always just made me so happy to see him on The West Wing. So when I saw him in this, I was like, oh, Clark Gregg's back. And then so seeing him play an agent character again was just so perfect.
I do this little thing. Are you familiar at all with the IMDb game?
No, I'm not.
Are you familiar with IMDb and how
I am, yeah.
For each actor, they will list like four films at the top of their page, what they're known for.
Right.
And it's not necessarily the most popular films. It's not necessarily the most profitable, or I shouldn't say just films, projects. There's a mix in there, and nobody quite knows what the algorithm is that IMDb uses to pull it. And so it makes for a fun guessing game, trying to say, okay, so Clark Gregg, what for projects of his would you guess are the things that are at the top of his IMDb page? Any ideas?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was, as you were talking and I cheated, I'm looking at it right now.
Oh, you're looking. I would have guessed at least I would have guessed Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Because that's like the big TV show that he's on. I would have guessed one of the other Marvel films that he was in. I mean, he's only in what, like 4? I guess I can scan down. He was in Iron Man 2, Thor, and the Avengers.
Right.
And that's
and then
it.
he died. And in the cinematic universe, he is still and remains dead. So he won't be coming back anytime soon there.
Right. But I would have guessed one of those. I don't know if I would have guessed the Avengers. That's the one that it actually has him as. I feel like I would have said either Thor, because I feel like he's got a bigger part in Thor, or Iron Man, because that's where you meet him. So, but it turns out to be the Avengers. I would never have guessed the New Adventures of the Old Christine, because I didn't know he was in that
I'm looking at that. I'm not clicking on that. I have zero idea what in the world that is. But
I knew the show existed. I just, other than Julia Louis-Dreyfus, I had no idea who was in the show. So it was a complete surprise to me. And then he was in the film Choke, which was an adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's novel. Again, I didn't know he was in it. I didn't know that was a film that I should have expected him to be in. It's a real surprise to me that that's the fourth choice on the IMDb list.
Weird. Yeah.
Right? I know.
And I'll be curious if any of your listeners want to write in and say, I don't know if I'm totally unique in being a West Wing fan of his, or if there were lots of others, because I don't always think of fandoms overlapping like that, but sometimes they definitely do. So.
Right. He's an interesting guy who's been in the industry for quite a while, and he actually did some stuff. I mean, he's been acting since the 80s, but he also has been a writer. In fact, he wrote the horror film that Robert Zemeckis directed, What Lies Beneath. In fact, he wrote and directed Choke. I would guess that is why that's the fourth one on his list right there.
Oh, that could happen.
Yeah. So he's an interesting guy.
And just while we're passing around trivia about him, he's also a bit of a hero of mine because he is married to Jennifer Grey, who, if anyone else is a big 80s movies enthusiast like I am, is both the star of Dirty Dancing and perhaps even more iconically, well, not more iconically, but more beloved, at least to my mind, the sister of Ferris Bueller in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So we're now way off into tangent land, but just one other cool fact about Clark Gregg.
And it's nonsensical, fun trivia, but I just love that he's one of those people whose name can be reversed and it still is a normal name. Greg Clark could be just fine too.
Well, yeah, no, it's definitely true. And for me, I think, so I went into this Iron Man movie knowing a little bit about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I didn't really know much about it, but I knew some of the basics. And I had to kind of be convinced to see it because I was not a big superhero movie person. Like, I liked the Spider-Man movies. I loved the Batman movie because I was a big Batman fan. But for the most part, I thought a lot of the movies that had been coming out around the time of this or come out beforehand seemed kind of hokey and silly. And I also remember just being kind of frustrated that, like, you have these huge comic book universes, and now, each individual movie is just going to be its own thing and kind of unconnected to anything. And so I distinctly remember when he says, I'm from the strategic homeland, I'm not going to rattle it all off, I kind of sat up in my chair and went, wait, what? Because this was also when the internet was just getting started. And I, again, not being a huge comic book fan, I hadn't followed any of the news about this movie. So I didn't know that there was any kind of attempt to build a larger cinematic universe happening. I just thought this was a movie about Iron Man. And when he said that, I had this moment of, wait a minute, are we just telling the Iron Man story, or are we actually going to go deep into this whole Marvel universe? And of course, that paid off in such wonderful ways. And so I'm always, when I think it's fair to say that I requested these particular minutes that we talk about. And this moment is definitely one of why, because I feel like this is the moment when Favreau is really telling us, I don't just want to tell the Iron Man story. If I get the money for it, I'm going to tell a much larger story. And I just think it still gives me a little bit of a chill every time I see it, because it's such a vital moment for this whole MCU.
It very much is. The acronym, of course, is Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division.
As
SHIELD.
Someone later says, you really wanted it to fit the SHIELD acronym, didn't you? I forget who that is.
Right. So SHIELD first appeared in Strange Tales number 135. This was August 1965, created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. And in that issue, it actually stood for Supreme Headquarters International Espionage Law Enforcement Division. So over the course of time, somewhere it changed. And I was trying to find at what point in time it actually, the acronym shifted. And I want to say that it was the movie that created that shift, but I don't know if I'm completely accurate with that. I'm going to have to keep digging to see if I can pinpoint specifically. What's interesting is reading that first issue of Strange Tales when SHIELD appears. It's really kind of following Nick Fury, and he's going through this test. as he comes to find out, it's because this organization, S.H.I.E.L.D., is recruiting him to be its leader. And Tony Stark is actually already on board, and he is one of the people that is working to recruit Fury as the head of the organization.
And when did you say this was?
August 1965.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting that Tony was already in on it and was one of the people who brought Fury on to lead it. So it's kind of an interesting little change that they made. I want to read more of these comics. That's the only one that I've read. I need to read more of the S.H.I.E.L.D. comics now to try getting a better sense of it and the whole story. But it is pretty interesting to see how it all came to be.
And it is for me especially because, as I mentioned at the end of your last podcast, the podcast that I'm part of, Superhero Ethics, one of the things that we're always looking at is the kind of ethical and moral questions. And one of the questions we keep coming back to is, okay, once humanity knows that people with superpowers exist, how do we respond? And one of the natural questions that first comes up for that is, should there be some sort of governmental regulation? Should there be an agency that oversees these kind of things?
Right.
And so for me, S.H.I.E.L.D. has always been one of the things I'm most interested in, because I think there are, and I think I like that the MCU, especially with Civil War, but with some of the other stories as well, has really done a great job of exploring this question of, is there a need to have a government agency that oversees these things? And if so, what powers should that agency have or not have? And how much should it be empowered to take away the privacy or perhaps even the freedom of the powered people in order to protect the rights of everybody else? And there's just so many ethical questions that leads into. And I feel like S.H.I.E.L.D. has been one of the best ways of exploring those questions in any of these stories.
Well, especially looking at Winter Soldier and how that really explores S.H.I.E.L.D. And I mean, obviously, we're not going to be talking about that film for a good number of years, but still, it poses some interesting questions about the people who are watching. It's just like Watchmen points out, who watches the Watchmen, and that whole aspect of it, especially if these people turn to the dark side, as it were. I find it to be an interesting dilemma, and we certainly start seeing glimpses of that here, and we get a sense of the reach of S.H.I.E.L.D. even just in this very brief conversation that Coulson has with Potts, because he says that he needs to debrief Mr. Stark on the circumstances of his escape. Just the way that he phrases that feels like they know a lot more as to what's been going on than he's letting on right here, because he's debriefing him on the circumstances of his escape. So I feel like they already know everything that's gone on.
Yeah, and one of the things that I get from this moment is that as however much he knows, he absolutely knows significantly more than Pepper does.
Yes.
And I think Pepper is clearly trying to on some level, I think Pepper just wants to blow this guy off, and with the whole I'll find something to put in the book. But I do think that part of this is also the moment where Pepper is starting to think, wait a minute, how much more to the story is there that I don't know? And the suspicion and her desire to confront Tony that comes much later in the movie, I kind of think starts in this moment as well.
It's interesting in the script, Pepper actually comes to Coulson before he comes to her. And again, this is one of those moments where I feel like the way that it's scripted and the way that it ended up in the film, there's enough of a subtle difference where the film version ends up being much more superior, because the way that he kind of approaches her, he knows who she is. He knows that she's kind of the doorway to get to Stark. But in the script, she sees him and says, "You'll have to take a seat, sir," because she just sees him. Well, it's weird. He approaches her, but she's the one who talks to him, and he's like, "Oh, I'm not a reporter," and then goes into the whole thing. But it's interesting how she's kind of the one who's kind of being more direct as opposed to being interrupted by him.
Right.
And it's very subtle, but I still feel like there's enough there that actually makes it to be an interesting point in the dynamics of the who these people are.
And in some ways, I feel like that speaks a lot to Phil Coulson's power and the power of S.H.I.E.L.D. Because to me, especially in these movies, or especially in this movie, if there's a phrase to me that comes to mind to describe Coulson and S.H.I.E.L.D., it's the walk softly and carry a big stick.
Right.
Because he doesn't feel a need to sort of push in and say, "Oh no, I'm one of the big agencies." He has no desire to impress her. Clearly, he's coming across as in his very sort of nebbishy, unimpressive way. he just knows he's from this agency that, of course, she's going to want to talk to and that he's going to want to talk to.
And what's funny about him is just as he mysteriously appeared next to her, when he's done talking to her, he just kind of mysteriously just disappears. He just kind of steps off to the side. And it's not as mysterious, I guess, but it cracks me up because he just kind of moves away and you just don't see him again. And yes, you do see him. He is in the back when you see the sit-in. He's sitting in the back row. Uh-huh. But it's not pointed out, and it's very funny to me that he kind of mysteriously appears next to Pepper and then just kind of vanishes. Like he's like this little magician. So
he has that Batman trick of just showing up and disappearing.
Exactly. It's very funny. So after that little exchange, we get to the front of the press conference, the main focus here, which is Obadiah's at the podium. And as we find out with a nice little pan down or a tilt down, a little hint of the comedy, we see Tony, who's sitting at the base of the podium, and he kind of requests all the reporters and everybody to sit down, which is really funny. And I guess that's an idea that Robert Downey Jr. had. And it makes the scene play, I think, a little more interestingly. And it I don't know, it gives it a different feel. And I like the way that happens.
I think so, especially because I think it really speaks to how much Tony has changed and now how different Tony is from Obadiah. That he doesn't want the corporate trappings anymore, that he doesn't want to be the big man giving the speech and everyone listening. He really wants to be on their level. He wants to just sort of sit down and have a chat with everybody.
Well, and it speaks also to that PTSD element, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you feel like there's a hint of that?
I think there is. Well, say more. What exactly are you thinking there?
It seems like this doesn't feel like the Tony that we met earlier in the film. I mean, he's casual, he's comfortable with people, he chats up anybody, but I feel like he is that leader who, I mean, he probably would be the guy behind the podium and would be running this press conference. And I feel like the way that he kind of handles this, and he's sitting and he's, again, here we go with that's the burger from the pocket that we finally get to see him pull out and start eating. It just feels like he's almost like at a little bit at a loss for how to act in the situation, especially because at the end, as he's eating the burger, he has kind of this emotional, it's almost a breakdown. Like he hits this point where he looks over at Obadiah, who sits next to him, and it almost looks like he's going to break into tears. There's a look on his face as he starts talking about his father that just kind of strikes me like this is a guy who's been going through a lot and he's been rescued finally, and it just feels like the moment's hitting him right here for me.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And to me, what especially I get out of this, which I think is setting something up that will become a huge part of Tony's arc throughout the whole series of movies, is that it feels to me like a man who doesn't want the weight of responsibility that he feels like he has to carry. Up to this point, he had been so happy to be like, I'm Tony, I'm in control, everything is okay. And now he has seen what the things he has done can do, what the weapons he has built can do out in the world, and what his kind of playboy attitude and not paying attention to things, what that did to the world. And to me, this is a man who is really wrestling with the guilt of that, and who's really wrestling with wondering, like, what did I do when I have power and I don't want to have power anymore? And I see that, and I feel like that I don't know how much I saw that the first time I watched this movie, but going back and watching it now, it's so clear because that becomes something that is so much a part of his character for the rest of the movies, where either A, he's trying to build a robot that can take the power away from him and thus can build Ultron, or he wants some other government agency to take the power away from him and thus he wants to give it all over to the Sokovia Accords. But whatever it is, I feel like what Tony Stark saw in that cave made him think, when I'm in control, when I'm in charge, terrible things happen. And as much as he keeps feeling a need to take control and to help things, it also feels like for most of the rest of the movies, the biggest thing he's trying to do is find someone else to take control. And that's kind of what I do when I see him sit down there, is him saying, I don't want to dominate you. I don't want to tell you all what to do. I just want to have a talk to you as equals.
I like that. That's actually a nice way to read that and to see that kind of change in his personality and the way that he's starting to create this mental shift. And I think some of that even comes out when he starts talking about his dad, because obviously he's had a very strong connection with his dad. We saw a picture with his father when we were in his workshop, when we see the presentation at the award ceremony earlier in the film. It's very clear that the relationship the two of them had and how he's kind of grown up really in his father's image and now is running his father's company. And just that moment that he has here, I never got to say goodbye to dad, I never got to say goodbye to my father, really kind of strikes a chord, because I think there's an element that he's starting to realize of almost like that duality of his father, where he's finally stepping back and realizing his father wasn't necessarily this guy to praise. And I mean, his father was this weapons manufacturer who was doing things that led to a lot of destruction on the earth. And he's never really seen that. And he's having this moment right here where he's almost seeing kind of this mental split of his father. He's seeing the father that he never got to say goodbye to, and he's having that real emotional connection to. But it's also leading us into this idea that we're going to be coming to in the next minute about what he experienced and what's changed about him.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, this conflict and the all the feelings he has about the loss of his dad is obviously such an important theme for him in the rest of his movies, and then in the Avengers movies, and then especially in the Civil War movie. But also I like what you're saying, because I think it points to the idea that this is a moment where Tony kind of has to grow up a bit, because so much of what he has been doing up until now is dad did it, and so dad was right, and if dad did it, it's right, and so I'm just going to keep doing what dad is doing.
Yeah.
And he's obviously brilliant and able to figure out all of these weapon systems, but he never asks why. And I think the reason is because in his mind, his father answered that question. His father did it. His father did it to beat the Nazis, and that was certainly a good reason.
Yeah.
And here again, this is my bailiwick is always wanting to look at how the movies are mirrors for larger questions. I also like this moment a lot because I think I'm going to back up a second, go on a bit of a tangent here, but I promise it's relevant. Not that long ago, Stan Lee passed away. And when he passed, one of the things that got talked about a lot was that he had really brought back the idea that comics didn't just have to be silly stories, but that they could be mirrors for real life issues and real life questions, and the way the X-Men talked about prejudice and racism and things like that. And, in our own world, this has been a question of the military was great in World War II against the Nazis, but then as later generations go, we spend more time questioning things about our government and about the military and about weapons and stuff like that. And I see that in Tony. His dad was fighting the Nazis, and that was great. Now, generations later, what are we using those weapons for? And people can have all sorts of different opinions on that question. But I really like this moment, because this moment was when the movie was kind of saying, we're not going to shy away from that. We're going to head on acknowledge that this isn't just a movie about something totally different that happens in this weird Marvel world. This is a movie that's holding up a mirror to some of the questions in our own world.
And I would say to that extent, it does even a better job with that, with the Iron Man Tony Stark character, than the comic books initially did. Not that the comic books didn't address it, but I think in the beginning, it really just worked to kind of make Tony Stark this playboy, this weapons manufacturer that was really against everything that kind of all the comic book readers who were kind of anti-war types despised. They made him into somebody who is likable and a superhero. I think all of that worked, but I still think that there was still that element of Tony where it still felt like he was running Stark Industries and manufacturing weapons. I don't feel like a lot of that changed. I felt like they handled it a lot better in the way that transition happened in the film. And I feel like Robert Downey Jr. really delivers it nicely. Mm-hmm. And it makes for a really powerful journey that we're going to be going on with him over not just this film and this moment, but all through the franchise.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it's one more way in which this press conference is just, you got to wonder how many of the plot lines and threads that become so vital throughout all of the MCU get started in this minute, in the minutes immediately before and afterward.
Yeah, it's very true. There's quite a bit that's going to be going on because of the way that this happens. So it's going to be an interesting exploration. I think that maybe we should end here and come back tomorrow to finish our conversation about this press conference, unless you have anything else you want to talk about here.
No, I think we kind of covered it. I think we hit the drop of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the discussion about his grief about his dad. To me, are the real fundamental points here. So I think we hit it well, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else Tony has to say when he's up behind those cameras.
Well, Matthew, remind everybody again where they can find you on the internet.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the podcast we do is called Superhero Ethics. You can find it on iTunes, on Podbean, on a couple of the other big Stitcher, a couple of the other big podcast sources. You can also find our website, which is mostly the podcast, but also some blog entries at www.superheroethics.com. And then also you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, also at that name, Superhero Ethics. We love to get into conversations with fans. The podcast tends to dive into a lot of these questions, as I said, from the MCU, but also from a wide range of other sources. And please check it out. And thank you again for having me on as a guest.
Awesome. And that's it, everybody, for today's show. So thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the show for free at marvelmovieminute.com. Join us over in our Discord chat room and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Next Reel. And if you like what we do and you want to support us and get some cool stuff, become a patron over at patreon.com/thenextreel. Until next time, true believers.